Did Josephus really mention Jesus? Really? I know this is what the scholars have said, and that is now the consensus opinion. But the logic says otherwise. We only have to really look at and analyze the text. Why is this relevant? It is hugely relevant because he is the main Jewish historian and stands outside the Bible. If Josephus were to have mentioned Jesus, this would be big evidence of his existence. We can see, therefore, why people who want Jesus to have existed in history would want him to have mentioned Jesus. But let us not worry about people's intentions and just study what the text says. Hello and welcome to Mindless Musings. Don't forget to like, subscribe, so we can keep on the good work. There are two areas where he apparently referenced Jesus in his Testimonium Flavianum, books 18 and 20. Now, the first text in book 18, most scholars agree it has been tampered with by Christians. Mythicists disagree. They say all of the text is an interpolation or forgery by Christians. We will examine both claims. First, let's look at the text. In book 18, Josephus wrote, "Now, there was about this time, Jesus a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians so named after him are not extinct at this day." Historicists say that the sentence, "He is the Christ," is the bit that was added by Christians. However, mythicists argue that all of the text is an interpolation for several reasons which we will get into. Mythicists also say that even if we can accept all of the text as authentic, Josephus's source could have only been the Gospels. It could not have been just oral tradition, because, as was shown earlier, Paul would have had access to this too. If you are wondering why we are talking about Paul, please see my earlier video on Paul's letters. Now, what are the reasons mythicists reject the text as an interpolation? First, it was fairly common at the time for interpolations to be whole chapters and not little bits interspersed in a chapter. If Christians forged some of the chapter, why not all of it? Second, this chapter does not flow with the general text of Josephus. It appears to stand out from the one before and after it. Third, unlike how Josephus would write, the passage gives no explanation why the people wanted Jesus dead, what his threat was. Josephus would usually give a background as he did on John the Baptist and his execution by Herod, and we will look at John the Baptist and what Josephus wrote on him. The only people who would know enough to fill the gaps in that passage, mythicists say, are Christians, not the everyday reader. Finally, and this is key, mythicists argue that Josephus would never use the word Christ for reasons including political and religious. He goes out of his way to avoid such words including Messiah. Now, historicists do agree that the Christ in that passage is an interpolation. However, historicists don't buy the argument that Josephus would never use the word Christ. It is important to remember this point for the argument on the next book, Book 20. Now, it is in Book 20 that the argument gets more fierce. I have rewritten this chapter in summary using everyday words except the key bits. "And when Caesar heard of the death of Festus, he sent Albinus to Judea as procurator. But the king, Agrippa, removed Joseph from the high priesthood and gave it to the son of Ananus. Now Ananus's father was fortunate. He and 5 of his sons have enjoyed the dignity of holding the role of high priest. But this younger Ananus just appointed was a man of high temper, insolent, and arrogant. He was also one of the Sadducees, who are very rigid and strict in judging offenders, above the rest of the Jews. So, this Ananus, following his nature, seeing that Festus was dead and Albinus was on the way, and he had the opportunity, assembled a Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. He accused them of breaking the law and put them to death by stoning. But the people were not happy at this blatant breach of the law, and urged the king to punish him. They even went as far as to speak with Albinus on the matter, telling him how it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Albinus wrote in anger to Ananus, and as a result, the king Agrippa took the high priesthood from him and made Jesus son of Damnaeus high priest in his place. Now, in this passage, whilst mythicists argue that the clause, who was called Christ, is an interpolation by Christians, historicists argue that it is not. Remember the point before about Josephus using the word Christ? Remember that historicists say Josephus could use this word, whilst mythicists say he would never? This chapter, if authentic as it stands, could be evidence for a historical Jesus, because it gives something outside the Gospels. And it would also support the claim of historicists that James referred to by Paul in Galatians 1:19 was a biological brother of Jesus, because they say this is that James mentioned here by Josephus. Josephus was a historian after all and would only write facts. Again, if you are not following, you may want to see my earlier video on James, not the brother of Jesus. Now, the following are the arguments mythicists have put forward to show those words, who was called Christ, are indeed an interpolation. First, once again, Josephus has used the word Christ, which he wouldn't. But even if he would, Josephus introduces the term, who was called Christ, without at least explaining what the term meant is, and why Jesus was called so. Remember, historicists agree that the Christ in Book 18 was an interpolation, so Josephus did not write it in Book 18. By the verdict of pretty much all historians, this was the first time Josephus was using the term Christ in reference to Jesus. But he gives no explanation or background. Only a Christian would get it without explanation. Second, reading the chapter, we can get a sense what message Josephus was trying to pass. He does not tell us the crime of James and the others, and these are not followers. Josephus used the Greek that means random others. However, Josephus tells us the crime of Ananus, illegal trial and execution of offenders. The whole chapter appears to be about Ananus and what he did that led to him losing the priesthood. It is even more compelling when we read the very last chapter before this one and see that Josephus had also been talking about a succession of high priests. So, why did Josephus name James out of all those executed? The only reason was to show his connection to that Jesus. So, this Jesus, brother of James, must have a connection to this story. If we accept this Jesus, brother of James, is Christ, where is the connection to the story? Why does the reader need to know that James is the brother of Jesus Christ? Historicists respond to this by saying that it is because in Book 18, Jesus was killed by the principal men of the Jews, so James, his brother, was also an enemy of the people. Mythicists say this is mere inference that does not come from the chapter in Book 20. Besides, for this explanation to make sense, Josephus would, at the very least, have given the reader an idea why Jesus was killed, how he threatened the authorities, what his crime was, in Book 18. For Josephus not to do that, leave the reader blank, and then expect the reader to infer that a connection to Jesus Christ got James and random others killed, without even saying what they were accused of. That is not up to his known standard. Mythicists repeat that the only people who could make such an inference without being confused are Christians. Secondly, the others killed with James are not shown to be in any way connected with James. They are just random others who may not have been Christians. So, why would Josephus bunch them up with the brother of Jesus Christ if Jesus Christ and Christianity had any connection to the story? This would be very shoddy historical reporting and not representative of the style of Josephus. We only have to compare with what he wrote of John Baptist to see his style. This is what he wrote of John the Baptist. Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist, for Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another, and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism. For that the washing with water would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away, or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best, by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties, by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner, out of Herod's suspicious temper, to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod, and a mark of God's displeasure to him. You can see the circular style of Josephus. He introduces a theme, the Jews believing Herod lost due to a crime against John. Then, he tells the story complete with the works and nature of John and what his threat to Herod was. And finally he closes with how this links with his starting theme. If we relate this style of writing to that book 20 and take out who was called Christ, mythicists argue, the chapter now fits with Josephus's style. First we see another Jesus ben Damnius getting the office of high priest after Ananus was removed. Mythicists say he is the Jesus whom Josephus called brother of James. With him as that Jesus, the story makes complete sense as it stands. The opening theme is how Ananus became high priest, a continuation from previous chapter on how his predecessor achieved and lost the priesthood. Next we have a story about Ananus and how he illegally set up a trial and executed offenders. Of the offenders, only James is named, simply to show his connection to a Jesus. Then, a Jesus ben Damnius becomes high priest in place of Ananus when justice had been done. Mythicists argue that it follows Josephus's style, and makes sense to see that Jesus ben Damnius was the brother of James. The chapter is showing how he became high priest after Ananus lost it, as well as how Ananus lost it. Jesus ben Damnius became high priest as a way of dispensing justice and compensation, not uncommon in those days. But even if this was not common practice, the story as a history piece now makes complete sense. The focus of the story from the previous chapter is on the succession of high priests, so a random connection between one of the victims, James, and a Jesus has to be linked with the outcome and focus of the story, showing how Jesus ben Damnius became high priest. With these arguments, they rule out Josephus as having made any reference to Christ independent of the Gospels, and so his reports cannot be used as a valid point of argument. As always, it's mindless musings. Thanks for watching and bye for now.